Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Jeff Pelley? Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case. I'll move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Starting with the background, this story starts in the 1960s when Robert Lee Pelley met a woman named Ava Joy Armstrong. They were both students at Mount Vernon Nazarene University in Ohio. By 1970, the couple would be married. They would have a son, Jeff Pelley, in 1971. In 1976, they would have a daughter named Jackie. Later, she would report that the family was close. She described them as normal. The family would move to Florida in the late 70s, first to Orlando, then to Cape Coral in 1979 or 1980. Robert had found a job in computer programming for a telephone company, although he was still interested in religious studies. He changed jobs not long after and worked for a bank in a data processing center. In 1984, Joy Pelley was diagnosed with skin cancer. She would die on February 24, 1985. She was 34 years old. Robert would not permit his 13-year-old son and his 10-year-old daughter to cry over their mother's death. He was a strict disciplinarian, and he had rules about expressing emotions. Around the same time in Ohio, a man named Edward Huber died in an accident or by suicide. It appears it's one or the other. It's not really clear. He left behind his 28-year-old wife, Dawn Huber. The couple had 3 daughters, Jessica, age 5, Janelle, age 4, and Jolene, age 2. Robert's 2 children were visiting relatives in Ohio when Robert traveled there to pick them up. He met Dawn, who was at his niece's house, visiting her best friend. The couple hit it off, and they would be married by November of 1985. The family initially moved to Florida, but then they would move to Lakeville, Indiana in 1986. Robert switched from computer programming to being a minister, taking over a congregation of about 100 members of the Olive Branch United Brethren Church. There was a parsonage on the property right next to the church. The family lived in the white ranch-style house. Robert earned a little bit over $1,200 a month, much less than he made working at the bank in Florida. It seems odd that Robert would have made this switch. It's not really clear what happened. It appears as though employees at the bank had been laundering money for a Colombian cartel. Later, 2 witnesses would say that Robert left Florida because he was afraid for his life. Before moving to the timeline of the crime, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Policy Genius. If someone relies on you for financial support, whether it's a child, aging parent, or even a business partner, you need life insurance. Policy Genius, America's leading online insurance marketplace, makes it easy to compare quotes from over a dozen top insurers all in one place. Why compare? You can save 50% or more on life insurance by comparing quotes with Policy Genius. You can save $1,300 or more per year on life insurance by using Policy Genius to compare policies. The licensed experts at Policy Genius work for you, not the insurance companies, so you can trust them to help you navigate every step of the shopping and buying process. Eligible applicants can get covered in as little as a week thanks to an award-winning policy option that swaps the standard medical exam requirement for a simple phone call. Getting started is easy. First, head to policygenius.com/Dr. Grande. In minutes, you can work out how much life insurance coverage you need and compare personalized quotes to find your best price. When you're ready to apply, the Policy Genius team will handle the paperwork and scheduling for free. Policy Genius never sells your information to other companies. Policy Genius doesn't add on extra fees. Click the link in the description to get started. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On Sunday, April 30, 1989, members of the church, where Robert was a pastor, started to show up for the 9:30 a.m. service. Robert wasn't there. This was highly unusual. One of the church members, named David Hathaway, walked over to the parsonage and knocked on the door. There was no answer. The door was locked, which was out of the ordinary. Hathaway noticed all the curtains and blinds were closed as well. Just after 10 a.m., Hathaway was able to get a key from another church member. Upon entering the house, he noticed Robert's glasses were on the floor in the hallway. He then saw Robert Pelley laying on his back in a pool of blood. Hathaway assumed that Robert was dead. He was correct. After the first responders arrived, they, too, acknowledged that Robert was dead. He had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the neck and chin. They found that Dawn, Janelle, and Jolene were in the basement. They had been shot to death as well. In total, the killer or killers had fired 6 shots, almost certainly 20-gauge shotgun slugs. 2 different types of slugs had been used. Other than the presence of homicide victims, nothing in the house was disturbed. The doors had been locked, there was no forced entry, nothing had been stolen. The other children were not in the house. 17-year-old Jeff Pelley was at the Great America Amusement Park near Chicago. 13-year-old Jackie was visiting friends at a nearby college, and 9-year-old Jessica was having a sleepover at a friend's house. The police started to focus the investigation on Jeff Pelley for a variety of reasons. They knew from some circumstances that occurred before the homicides that he might have a motive. Robert was strict with his family, as I mentioned. He and Jeff didn't always get along. On one occasion, Robert punched Jeff. Jeff wanted to go to his high school prom, but before the prom, Jeff had been caught burglarizing a home. He had stolen under $100 in cash and about 40 CDs. CDs were relatively new in 1989. The police agreed not to arrest Jeff as long as he apologized to the victim and returned the property. Robert refused to let Jeff attend the dinner before the prom or the events after the prom, and the only way Robert was going to allow Jeff to go to the prom was if Robert drove him. Jeff had his own car, a silver 1984 Ford Mustang, and would have been embarrassed to have his father drive him to the prom. Robert had even gone so far as to hide the keys to the Mustang, canceled the insurance on it, and removed 2 fuses and the distributor cap so the vehicle could not be operated. 1984 Mustangs didn't really need help not running. That's kind of their specialty. There was no need to remove parts from that car. It was designed to do that automatically. The police thought that it was odd that Jeff was not more upset about his parents being killed. They said he wasn't showing enough emotion. There was a 20-gauge shotgun in the house before the murders. After the murders, the shotgun was missing. The police believe the 4 murders took place on Saturday, April 29, 1989, which is the day before the bodies were discovered. They believe the murders occurred between 4:50 p.m., when one witness reported she left the parsonage, and 5:10 p.m., when another witness said Jeff's Mustang was still at the parsonage. They believe Jeff committed the homicide in this narrow 20-minute window. Even though the police suspected Jeff was the killer, the prosecutor at the time didn't think there was enough evidence to get a conviction. In 2002, a new prosecutor took over. He believed that a conviction was possible. Jeff was arrested. By this time, he was 34 years old, living in Florida, and working for IBM. Here's the state's theory of the crime, which they presented at trial. Angry at his father for not allowing him to drive to the prom himself, Jeff retrieved his father's 20-gauge shotgun. He shoots his father twice, then makes his way to the basement, where he shoots his stepmother and 2 stepsisters. He removes all of his clothes and puts them in the washing machine. He retrieves the spent shell casings. Now naked, he goes back upstairs and picks up the 2 other shell casings next to his father's body. Jeff takes a shower or otherwise cleans himself up in the bathroom, then puts on different clothes. He turns out all the lights, closes the curtains, locks the doors, and makes his way out to his Mustang with his prom tuxedo, the shotgun, and the spent shell casings. He replaces the fuses and the distributor cap his father had removed from his vehicle and gets it running again. He gets rid of the shotgun and the shells somewhere along the road on the way to pick up his prom date. Jeff was convicted of 4 counts of murder in 2006. He was sentenced to 160 years in prison. His conviction was initially overturned on appeal in 2008, but then upheld by the Indiana Supreme Court in 2009. Now moving to my analysis. Was Jeff Pelley actually guilty? Let's look at the evidence both for and against the idea he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory evidence. On Friday, April 28, the day before the murder, Jeff told his girlfriend, who was also his prom date, that his father had lifted the restrictions about going to the prom. but he told her not to mention it in front of his father. Why would he need that to be a secret? At 5:30 p.m. on April 29, visitors stopped by the parsonage about an appointment that Robert missed. They received no answer to the door. This suggests the victims may have been dead at this time. On April 30, when Jeff was at the amusement park with his girlfriend, she said that he told her that he had a bad feeling. He didn't know what it was about. It was just a bad feeling. He didn't specifically mention his family being murdered or anything like that. Jeff Pelley had a criminal history. In addition to the burglary that he confessed to just before the murders, he had been caught engaging in other activities like breaking into cars, smoking marijuana, shoplifting, and forging a check from a women's group at the church. He had to apologize to that group after being caught. Jeff drove to pick up his date not wearing his tuxedo. He had to change into it after arriving. There were never any pictures taken with his family. This was unusual compared to what most teenagers would do for a prom. Jeff stopped at a gas station on the way to his prom date's house and asked for a screwdriver. Perhaps he was trying to get the vehicle working. Perhaps he had improperly installed the distributor cap. There was no forced entry into the parsonage. Outside the homicides, nothing else in the house was disturbed or stolen, as I mentioned. A 20-gauge shotgun was missing from the Pelley home, and the murder weapon was thought to be a 20-gauge shotgun. Jeff and his father had been arguing. Jeff wanted something his father wasn't willing to give him, that is, to drive himself to the prom. Jeff drove his Mustang even though it was uninsured. It had been for almost 3 weeks. Why would Robert allow Jeff to drive without insurance? Jeff is the only person known to have an opportunity to have committed the crime. Now moving to the exculpatory evidence. The prosecution's theory of the crime only allows for 20 minutes for Jeff to shoot and kill all 4 victims, collect the shell casings, remove his clothes, wash his clothes, clean himself, get dressed, and climb into his vehicle. Jeff did not have any bruises on his shoulders. It is very difficult to believe that he could fire a 20-gauge shotgun 5 to 7 times and not have a bruise on his shoulder. There is some dispute about whether a 20-gauge shotgun was actually in the house. There were different stories. Robert apparently would somewhat frequently buy and sell firearms. On the day he was murdered, he was shopping for guns. There were no 20-gauge shells found in the house. Did Robert own a 20-gauge shotgun but not have any ammunition for it? Doesn't really seem like that would make a lot of sense. What would be the point of owning a weapon that you could not fire? Jeff acted normally at the prom. After wiping out his family, he was able to function normally and not stand out in any way. This seems difficult to believe. Presumably, this would have been his first quadruple murder. How did he maintain his composure so well? Jeff Pelley's stepmother had written a check made out to Jeff. In the memo, she wrote prom. This makes it seem as though the whole prom issue may have been cleared up before the murder. Maybe Jeff really did have permission. The only time Jeff would have been able to dispose of the shotgun and the shells was between 4:50 p.m. on the Saturday when the murder happened and 5:30 p.m. on that same day. The house where he picked up his prom date was between 20 and 30 minutes away, and he arrived at 5:30 p.m. He stopped at a gas station along the way, arriving at 5:17 p.m., and was there for at least 8 minutes. He could not have deviated too far off the route in order to dispose of the evidence, or he would have taken noticeably longer to complete the drive. Why couldn't the police find the evidence in such a restricted search area? Evidently, they searched the area extensively. No blood was found on Jeff, his clothing, or in his vehicle. Just a few minutes before the murder, Jeff invited one of his friends into the garage to hang out. That friend realized that he forgot his corsage, and he made his way home. Why would Jeff have asked this person to hang out if he knew he was about to commit a quadruple homicide? I mentioned before that Robert left the bank in Florida under suspicious circumstances, like the whole money laundering situation for a Colombian cartel. Cartel members exhibit a particular sensitivity about people taking their money and often respond in a less than prosocial manner. When Robert was hired at the church in Indiana, the church had purchased a National Registry listing which was to contain Robert's photograph. Robert was not happy about this. He told the photographer that people were hunting for his family. Not long before the murder, a member of the community saw Robert talking to a mysterious individual in a black truck. This is a fairly small town they're in. At that time, about 500 or 600 people. The individual did not recognize the man or the truck, so an outsider was in the town that day speaking to Jeff. So now going back to that question, considering all of the evidence, was Jeff Pelley guilty? I'll look at both the legal standard and in reality. By the legal standard, there's no way that Jeff Pelley was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, at least not in my opinion. There are a multitude of reasonable doubts. The compressed timeline, the cartel, no physical evidence tying him to the crimes, no bruises on his shoulder. There's just too many aspects of the state's theory of the crime that don't make sense. What about in reality? Jeff was exhibiting some antisocial behavior leading up to the crime, but at the same time, he was not initially arrested for murder, and he went on with his life. When Jeff allegedly committed the murders, he was 17. He was far from sophisticated, yet we are to believe he carried out the homicides with the speed, precision, and cautiousness of a professional assassin. I believe Jeff was actually innocent. I don't think he had anything to do with the homicides. Jeff being able to pull off this crime the way the prosecution described would be more unlikely than him being innocent. I believe Robert Pelley involved himself in a dangerous activity, moved to a small town in order to escape, but was unsuccessful. The police focused in on Jeff right away. They never seriously looked at any other suspect. They contorted the timeline like a pretzel in order to make Jeff the killer they needed him to be. I think Jeff Pelley's lack of emotions really hurt him. I've talked about before in other videos how the police seem to believe they're mental health experts. They look at these different emotional reactions that occur in a time of tremendous crisis and make determinations about what they mean. People react differently to stress. It's not a terribly unusual reaction to feel numb after something as severe as multiple homicides. Jeff could have just been in a daze. Maybe he didn't know what to think. So it made him look like he was perhaps psychopathic, but I think it could have been a relatively normal reaction, at least for him. I mean, he had not been through other homicides before. They didn't have any type of baseline to compare it to. The police couldn't say, hey, look, for these other 100 homicides that you've seen, you were all broken up. You were sad, you were crying. And for these 4, you're not. That's not how it works. We see that Jeff's reaction was probably, again, not that unusual, and yet it was interpreted in the worst possible way. There's one thing to have an unusual reaction, even if somebody wants to make that argument, like, okay, maybe his reaction was atypical. That still doesn't mean it points to him as a killer. It doesn't mean he was homicidal. It just means he was different in that particular reaction. So the police often attribute some type of ill intent, some type of malice to those reactions, especially if somebody's not showing a lot of emotion. I think that's what really ended up convicting Jeff Pelley. It certainly wasn't a timeline that makes him look guilty or much other evidence that makes him look guilty. It really was his emotional reaction. So we see another case really heavily dependent on determining something from emotions that really cannot be determined. Those are my thoughts on the case of Jeff Pelley. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.